Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Obviously, we have a real challenge ahead of us here today on the show because, on the one hand, you know, if you're in the kind of the sports talk world that I'm in, you got to kind of call it like it was on Saturday. That was as ugly a game as we've seen Georgia play in a long time, and I think you've got to own that, admit that. We'll do our part to do that today. But, y'all, at the same time, I think you've also got to keep the big picture perspective of what college football is right now, where there are a lot of teams who've had some ugly games here this year, and Georgia is still fighting for its playoff life this upcoming Saturday against Tennessee, and we need Dog Nation to be ready to go for that game. So we're going to try to sort of have both those conversations here today, and you can judge us how we do. We may be more negative than some of you want us to be. We may be more positive than some of you want us to be, but we're going to kind of call it the way we see it, the best that we possibly can. Jon Stinchcomb stops by today. He'll help us out with all of that. One of the things in particular we're going to talk to Jon about is the play of this Georgia offensive line and why this group has seemingly regressed as much as it has. I'll also ask Jon whether it's fair to criticize Carson Beck for the image that many of you have seen of him near the end of the game on Saturday on the sideline, appearing to be smiling while Georgia's in the midst of essentially a blowout loss. Is that taken out of context? We'll let Jon tell us more about that on the show here today, too. So we got a lot of ground to cover. We're going to try to do our best to do it well, and we're going to try to get ready somehow, some way for what needs to be an awesome atmosphere on Saturday and a big win against a Tennessee team that's obviously got its own playoff aspirations. So we knew it was going to be a challenging season. We are literally in the midst of it. And perhaps Georgia licking its wounds today more so than many of us would like. But we'll talk about all of it right now. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Let me begin with two things here today. Thing number one is this, and this is away from football. I want to wish and extend a happy Veterans Day to all of the veterans who listen to our program on a regular basis. I say this all the time, and I mean this as sincerely as I'm capable of. The fact that people who are oftentimes active duty, overseas, or the fact they take our show with them, listen to it there, allow us to be that sort of taste of back home while they are in many cases in harm's way and certainly a long way away from the comfort of home. That is one of the most awesome privileges I can ever imagine. A lot of, retired military listen to our show, veterans from armed services listen to our show. I take a great deal of pride in that. My dad was a Vietnam vet. My wife's dad was a Vietnam vet. My grandfather on my mother's side was a Korean War vet. My dad's dad was a veteran too. We are just, I think so shaped in our family by that. Many of you would say the same thing too. So happy Veterans Day to everyone out there who is serving and has served in our armed services. We are all greatly indebted to all of you. I also want to say this, which is I began last week's show by saying there is a very good chance this Georgia team is just not going to win the national championship. We said that after a win last week against Florida, but I want to say that to begin today's show too. Y'all, the evidence is out there in front of us. It just may not end that way this year. This may not be that level of team. This may be too tough of a schedule. This may be too challenging a season. It just may not end the way that many of us want it to. So as a fan, what I then want is, if you can't hold up the trophy at the end of the season, here is what I want. I said this last week. I'm going to say this again today. What I want is for it to last as long as it can. I want it to extend as long as it possibly can. Find a way to make the playoffs, then maybe find a way to win a game once you get there, and then figure it out from there. Just let it go as far as it possibly can. So we're not going to give up on anything until all hopes have been relinquished. And even after an awful loss for Georgia to Ole Miss on Saturday, obviously your hope isn't completely abandoned, but it is certainly shaken. And you certainly probably have some really tough questions to ask about gosh, how have things seemingly changed so much for UGA? So what we're going to try to do here for a few minutes is be honest about what happened on Saturday, but also be honest about what still can happen in the event that Georgia can shake all of this off. And as I was telling the video audience before we started a moment ago, for some of you, hey, we may come down a little too hard on UGA from where you would sort of want us to be. We may be too negative. I've gotten some of those criticisms a little bit lately. For other people, we may be trying to put too much of a sort of a happy veneer on all of this. You may criticize us for that. But either way, we're going to try to call this the way that we think it is, for the bad and for the good. So let's start with this. I thought that Kirby Smart, in his post-game press conference on Saturday, in his opening statement, kind of summed all of this up pretty succinctly and, frankly, in a way that probably needed to be said about just how thorough this beatdown that Ole Miss administered to UGA really was. And one phrase in particular stood out from all of that. This is Kirby Smart after the game on Saturday.
A lot of credit goes to Lane and his staff. Look, they really should be undefeated. I know people think that's not true, but they really controlled the game against LSU the whole game and lost it. And they're playing good football. And they outplayed us tonight, outcoached us, and did a great job.
Outplayed and outcoached. That's what Kirby Smart says Georgia was against Ole Miss on Saturday, and it certainly seems like that's true. And listen, there's no area of the team that's blameless right now. You know, Georgia's defense, obviously after that first series where they really got after Jackson Dart, knocked him out of the game, got a turnover. After that, they were just struggling to keep pace with Ole Miss. Couldn't get any kind of pass rush. You know, we saw, Lane Kiffin, to his credit, scheming his receivers wide open. And without their best receiver, Trey Harris, in fact, they were still able to do that. Cade Lee, the kid from Kennesaw Mountain, he's just wide open all day long. An amazing offensive game plan for Ole Miss, and Georgia's defensive deficiencies in pass coverage in particular sort of allowed that to be true. So it's not a blameless day for the Georgia defense, but for the most part, Georgia defense also held them to field goals a few times, kept them under 30 points the game. I mean, I thought that Georgia's defense at least gave Georgia a chance to win the game. Short field that led to Georgia's only touchdown. I thought that the Georgia defense at least gave Georgia a chance to win the game. So while it wasn't always perfect for them, and pass coverage-wise, their boy is about as rough as we've seen them be, I can't quite put as much on the Georgia defense after Saturday as I do the Georgia offense. And, y'all, I mean, I don't know what's happened here, or at least I don't know the full extent of what's happened here. These same two teams played a year ago, and Georgia won the game 50-something to 17. And in a year, the result not quite fully flipped, but you go from blowing out Ole Miss to essentially being blown out by Ole Miss on Saturday, and that's basically what that was. Georgia was really struggling to keep pace with Ole Miss for much of the game. Yeah, I know it's not Brock Bowers anymore, and it's not Ladd McConkey anymore. And yeah, I get that. But, man, and we talked about on Friday, too, the fact that Ole Miss was really motivated to get its program right, to get its NIL game right, after how badly they got beaten by Georgia last year. And eventually we're going to talk more about that. We're not going to do it today, but eventually we're going to talk more about, I think what that game Saturday means for, like, the current landscape we live in college football. We're definitely going to do some more of that. But still, it is really eye-opening. The same two teams essentially play each other 2 years in a row, and the result is so different from one year to the next. Hard not to look at this as just some real regression, especially for Georgia on the offensive side of the ball. Like right now, this offense is really struggling to do anything, to run the ball, to throw the ball. Clearly on the offensive line, we're going to talk a lot about that today. Like there is just not much happening for Georgia offensively at all. And once again, to let you hear from Kirby Smart, he was sort of asked about that. Okay, so you get the short field to begin the game. Georgia somehow, some way, strains its way to a touchdown. Had to go for it on fourth down, even on that. But then after that, I mean, it essentially went into the freezer. Georgia didn't really do anything offensively after that. And Kirby talked about those offensive struggles and exactly why it was that everything just looked so hard for UGA against that Ole Miss defense.
Well, we didn't have a great run game going, and sometimes we ran the ball well. I thought that their front defensively stunts and moves a lot, so they're very disruptive. So you have to be willing to go outside. We had some outside run game. I thought Nate did a really good job. Unfortunately, he had a turnover, but he ran the ball really hard. And we talked all week about how they go after the ball. So give them credit, but when you have the penalties we have and you have the sacks, you're not going to be very successful, right? Penalties stop drives, and sacks stop drives, and we had both those.
Yeah, I mean, Kirby mentions sacks and penalties, way too many of, I guess, all that. And Nate Frazier's a guy from a playmaking standpoint, you kind of want him in the game. But when you see him, coughing up the football, one turnover that they lost Ole Miss and another one they could have, makes you understand a little bit more about why Georgia's perhaps been a little bit hesitant to put him in the game. Obviously, they know more about this. They're seeing him on a regular basis, and it certainly seems like as a young football player, ball security is a real issue. But, Kirby's not saying this, but I think we all saw this with our own eyes. Georgia right now, I think, seems to know that it's got a little bit of a struggling quarterback. And so it certainly appeared that Georgia came into this game on Saturday with the hope of taking the pressure off of Carson Beck. We talked last week about how Georgia doesn't talk much about keep chopping wood anymore, and yet, lo and behold, their hype video for this upcoming game was the idea of chopping wood and it all, kind of going back to that sort of old mantra that used to exist. It certainly seemed like Georgia at the beginning of the game was trying to establish the run. And a few times it almost seemed like it was working, but ultimately they weren't really doing, on a per-play basis, they weren't really doing that very well either. So it's like, they tried to take some pressure off the passing game, it seemed, kind of put more of that on the running game, and it's just absent. Georgia's just not opening up holes right now big enough for running backs to run through. Running backs perhaps aren't missing enough of those, tackles, although they're probably facing contact a lot sooner than they'd like to. This is just not a Georgia running game that you can lean on right now. And when the passing game is struggling, the running game cannot step up and sort of fill that void. It just right now seems like, based on Saturday, that's sort of the case. And, after the game, Carson Beck sort of acknowledged that too, that the reputation that Georgia once had as a very successful running team, right now, this team, for better or worse, is just not really living up to that reputation very well. This is what Beck said about that, kind of an honest assessment after the game was over.
Kirby, were you guys hoping that Carson would be able to settle in before you can kind of...
Do we have
our identity here for so long, has been to run the ball, and we just weren't able to, do that tonight, and, maybe whenever that happens, I got to step up and we got to make some explosive plays in the pass game, or maybe I got to start making some, plays on the ground, which, I tried to start extending plays and, running a little bit more in the second half, but, we just got to be explosive, and someone's got to step up and make a play whenever, we're not able to run the ball comfortably.
We talked about this a little bit on Saturday in our post-game show, the idea that when Brock Bowers was here, he was the easy button. You always kind of knew you could push that easy button and get yourself out of a tough situation. Last year at Auburn, for instance, Georgia just kept going to Bowers over and over as a way of getting out of that game and avoiding upset against an Auburn team that certainly was playing better at home last year than most people would have expected in that particular spot. Georgia doesn't really have that easy button right now. That's what Beck is seemingly alluding to, that, hey, in the absence of a running game, you got to sort of figure out, what is it you are going to do? And what Carson doesn't say there, but probably needs to be said, is the only reason why Georgia probably wanted to lean so heavily on its running game was because this is a passing attack that's not really working right now either. That in trying to take some shots and throwing deep down the field, there have been too many instances like there was against Florida where it turns into 3 interceptions. And those extra possessions really limit your chance to win the game. It doesn't ultimately cost you against Florida because Florida's not really good enough to beat you because Florida's not very good. Makes the game closer than it should be, but Florida's not going to beat you. But in the case of Ole Miss, clearly that would beat you. And it certainly seems like Georgia came in with about as cautious of a game plan in terms of how it chose to throw it as I've kind of ever seen. Now, this was another situation where Kirby was kind of challenged on that after the game. And once again, it's like a lot of the things that Kirby has sort of said about quarterback this year kind of defies logic, and I think strains most of our understanding about what's actually happening. I think a lot of us, frankly, feel like that Kirby perhaps hasn't always been totally forthright with how he's talked about the struggles that Georgia's had in its passing attack. And I don't put all of that on Carson because Carson's obviously had a lot of drops too. Pass protection was certainly an issue on Saturday. This isn't a failure that's owned by Carson Beck alone, But it was another example on Saturday where the way in which Kirby Smart talks about this Georgia passing attack doesn't seem to match most of our understanding of reality. I'm going to give you Kirby, the question he got from the reporter, the way that Kirby answered it. And I'm going to be honest with you, I think that Georgia fans deserve better as an explanation than what Kirby offered on this struggling passing attack on Saturday. This is Kirby after the game.
Kirby, were you guys hoping that Carson would be able to settle in before you can kind of cut him loose offensively, given he's had some turnover issues in recent games?
I don't understand your question.
In the first half, it seemed like, just in terms of the approach, maybe protecting the ability.
No, I didn't think so. I thought he came out gunning and throwing. Carson had his best week of practice. I thought Carson did some good things. He threw some play-action strikes. He stepped up and made some great third down plays. There was no – I don't really know what you're referencing. I guess you're saying that we didn't come out throwing the ball, or what are you saying? I thought Carson played good, guys. I thought he played good. I mean, some of those penalties aren't on him, and some are. He had a couple snafus, too, where he maybe didn't motion a guy or didn't shift somebody in. That's part of the adjustment, and he knows that. But we put a lot on him, and he's playing on the road with crowd noise. But he stands in that pocket and converted some third downs and made some really nice plays. And I thought he threw the ball away a couple times tonight. It was really good. So I'm not here to be critical of him.
I want to be clear about something. I'm not all that interested in being all that critical of Carson Beck here either. What I have a problem with in Kirby Smart's answer there was the idea that Kirby says, oh, yeah, Carson came out, the phrase that Kirby used, gunning and throwing. Would anybody watch that game from Georgia, the offensive game plan they put together, and thought, man, Carson Beck is gunning and throwing right now? I think it was Dawg Stats on X. Some of y'all know him. I think that he had the average depth of target for Beck in this game to be like 4.1 yards. I mean, Georgia was essentially throwing everything very short, kind of at the line of scrimmage, as careful a game plan as possible. To be honest with you, it was the sort of game plan that you'd sort of have when, like, Joe Tereshinski's filling in for DJ Shockley, not a quarterback who would fashion himself as a potential first-round pick. This was as safe and careful a game plan when it comes to throwing the football as I've ever seen Georgia have. And when you pair that with a running game that's not really working, then Georgia was frankly just lucky to score it all, and it only did because it had one short field to begin the game. Like I do believe that Georgia fans deserve a better acknowledgement from Kirby about what they were clearly trying to do with the passing attack, limit the impact of a quarterback right now who's just throwing the ball to the other team far too much. That description from Kirby does not seem to match reality. I think that we hopefully can all agree on that. But that's not the only issue. And on Saturday, maybe it's not even the biggest issue. We saw the Georgia offensive line just get really whipped. Now, some of that's because Ole Miss is outstanding up front. They have spent big bucks on transfer players to come off the edge, to impact the interior defensive line. Their free agents are all playing very well for them right now. Some of this is just about a major talent acquisition on the part of Ole Miss. But part of the reason you want to have a good offensive line is so that you can kind of do battle with these great defensive fronts. We thought that Georgia was supposed to have one. It has not really worked out that way thus far this year, and it was as bad as it's been there on Saturday. So while we're going through the diagnosis of all this, you got to mention that too. Georgia offensive line really, and I just hate to say it, but I don't take pleasure in this, but really got whipped by Ole Miss. Kirby Smart kind of talked about the impact of a Tate Ratledge injury and a Micah Morris injury on, kind of how all of that played out. Here's one more from Kirby.
Yeah, it's tough right now because Tate didn't practice all week. We thought he'd be able to go like he did against Florida. He was not able to take much reps, but we thought he'd be able to go in the game just off experience. He struggled. That foot is still not completely healed, and he's out there giving us all he can. And so that made it a little harder. Micah's still dealing with injury, too, from the Florida game. So those two guys struggled. We tried to play a combination of Truss and Drew rotating in at guard and still playing our three tackles. They did a good job. Princely did a great job with get off. And when you get in a mode of I have to throw the ball, you can get in trouble in this league, especially on the road. And we had some drives there where we had to throw the ball, and we struggled to block Princely in obvious passing situations.
So there you go. As honest as I'm capable of being, the defense wasn't good, but the offense was downright terrible. They couldn't throw it, they couldn't run it, and the offensive line was just getting shoved about wherever Ole Miss wanted to move them to. And sometimes I sort of feel like the job is, for better or worse, to come in here and just be honest about it. Georgia laid an egg offensively in every way imaginable on Saturday. It's as bad as you can describe it. That's how bad it was. And yet at the same time, in this current landscape in which we're living, the responsibility here is to sort of flush it and move on and be like a lot of teams this year who've had to shake off bad performances and try to find a way to get better. So with that on this show, kind of representative of Georgia fans, we're going to try to do the same thing here of, hey, as bad as it was, you can't linger on it very long because the chance to kind of make people forget about that by having a much better performance against Tennessee this upcoming Saturday, that is your responsibility now going forward. So we're going to try to do our part to kind of turn the page with Georgia here and figure out how it gets better against the Vols. In fact, we're going to talk about that here moving forward. But first, let's take some time to introduce the show. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We are happy that you're with us here, video 10 a.m., radio, Athens Sports Radio 960 Ref, podcast, wherever you find them. Just really, really glad that you're with us here today, even on a tough day for Georgia after a really ugly loss to Ole Miss. We're still thankful to be talking Georgia football with you here today. And as we mentioned, thankful to all those veterans, armed service personnel who tune in and are part of our show here, too. Also, big thanks to our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia who make it all possible. Energy-efficient windows and doors, that is what Pella Window and Door is all about. That means you kind of move into a fall time of year. You get that little drizzle, that little overcast. It's fall on the outside. You want to feel cozy and toasty and warm on the inside. That's what Pella Windows and Doors give you a chance to do. They also make your home look great on the outside, too. Homeowners want to take the best possible care of their home possible. You just want to protect that investment, and upgrading your windows and doors is a great way to do that. That's what Pella Window and Door of Georgia wants to do for you. So you can schedule in-home consultation. The folks from Pella will come over and talk about, kind of how you can get the upgrade that you need and take advantage of the amazing technology. I mean, frankly, the window, the door technology always is improving. And if you haven't upgraded your, home in years, I think you'll be surprised to kind of see what's available to you now and the options that are all out there for you. So that's why I think you ought to have a conversation with one of those Pella experts about all of that. It's not a pressure situation. They just want to inform you. They want to explain why Pella is so respected as a market leader when it comes to these windows and doors. And they can tell you about great saving opportunities, too. Because between now and November 30th, you can get $250 off per qualifying window and $500 off per qualifying door, or you can get no payments, no interest if paid in full within 12 months. You can also stop by and see them. Experience Center there in Duluth. Just give them a call, 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429. Also the website, PellaGA.com/DawgNation. PellaGA.com/DawgNation. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is going beyond. All right, we're glad to have them as a part of our program. Glad to have Jon Stinchcomb here coming up in a moment. Prior to that, though, I'm going to go around the doghouse, courtesy of Dr. Pepper, poured by our friends at Dr. Pepper here today. And what I said a moment ago, this is not like empty rhetoric. I do really mean this. Y'all, Saturday was as bad as it gets, but now it's over. And now it's Tennessee looming this upcoming Saturday. And Georgia has a chance to, let's face it, Ole Miss had lost twice this year. Ole Miss had lost a rivalry game to LSU, had got beaten by Kentucky, but their fans on Saturday acted like it was their Super Bowl, and the Ole Miss team fed off that crowd to go get the big win. Alabama lost to Vanderbilt at one point in time this year, and yet they're riding high again after blowing out LSU. We'll talk more about that game a little bit later on. That this is a year where a lot of teams are shaking off bad performances, especially in the SEC. These Big Ten teams don't play anybody. But in the SEC, a lot of teams are having to shake off bad performances and just sort of find a way to get better. And that is the opportunity that exists for Georgia to turn the page, to focus on somehow, some way, feeding off a favorable crowd. Georgia hasn't played a home game in what seems like 6 years, but feeding off a crowd that's behind you. It's just a chance for Georgia to be better. And as bad as it was on Saturday, we felt it was important to be honest about that. But at the same time, we also feel that it's important that we kind of implore all of you, man, let's get the vibes right now moving forward. And, if you're ready to come down hard on Mike Bobo or come down hard on Carson Beck, y'all, if that's true, it'll be even doubly true next Saturday, okay, or after next Saturday. If that's really true, if you need to drop the hammer on somebody with your opinions and your takes and things like that, that'll be even more true after Georgia performs poorly against Tennessee. But would you be willing to hold off on a week? Would you be willing to wait just a little bit and see if by chance that Georgia does what other SEC teams have done this year too, which is shake off another bad performance and give you a better performance, feed off a good home crowd, and beat Tennessee? Would you join us this week in trying to set the right mood for Tennessee now that we've acknowledged how bad it was against Ole Miss to try to do the right thing here? I mean, it seems like Kirby Smart was also trying to do that after the game on Saturday, acknowledging that what kind of happened to Georgia is sort of a byproduct of playing in the toughest league in the sport here right now. More from Kirby Smart.
It's on to the next. I mean, welcome to the SEC, baby. I mean, I said when the season started that it was going to be the toughest schedule we've ever had in the SEC, with the addition of the Texas game on top of all the others we had to play, and it's extremely tough. It's difficult. I mean, the outlook of going to those 4 road games, the Kentucky, the Texas, the Alabama, and this one, we knew it was going to be really tough. And as you go through the season, you get injuries. I mean, they got injuries too. Everybody's got injuries. It just makes it tough, and it's tough. But you know what? Our future's in front of us. We got a big game next week. We got to go out and we got to find a way to execute at a higher level.
Yeah, so Georgia's still favored over Tennessee. They're 9-point favorite. At least that's what the line opened with. Now, obviously, we would expect there's probably some money that comes in on Tennessee. Right now, Georgia's being heavily doubted, but you may not have loved everything that Kirby Smart said about, the passing game and stuff like that, and I certainly had some thoughts about that. But I do think that he's expressing absolutely the right perspective there of now it's time to move on. And he talks about the future being in front of Georgia. And everything that Georgia wants to accomplish is still possible. And frankly, it's quite possible if Georgia can just find a way, somehow, some way, to sort of show some improvement and beat Tennessee this upcoming Saturday. And that idea of not giving up and still fighting for a better future, even after a very disappointing Saturday night, Smart talked even more about that on Saturday as well.
It's a different world. Like, we're not riding this roller coaster wave of emotion. We're on a long journey. It's a long journey. And you got to play the next play. You got to play the next game. And that's the goal for this group. That's what I told them in there. It's like, guys, our future's in front of us. We got to figure out how to get better.
So here's the deal. Like, I realize, and we've done these shows now for years, when Georgia loses a game, fans are in a bad mood, and rightly so. And in a previous era, A, Georgia almost never lost, but B, any loss was just an absolute catastrophe. Well, this loss, performance-wise, was about as bad as it gets to the eye. Watching this was an unpleasant experience. But losses now are not as catastrophic as they used to be. Now, you may say, well, this loss proves that Georgia's not going to beat Tennessee. They're not going to beat anybody. They're not capable of winning a playoff game. Look, maybe history will prove you right on that. But would you be willing to wait a week to say it? Would you be willing to let this week be what it can be? Would you be willing to give Georgia a chance to feed off some positive vibes, to get the win against Tennessee that perhaps makes people forget about Ole Miss, the same way that beating Texas made folks kind of forget about Alabama? Would you be willing to let this week be what it possibly can be? It's not going to be easy for everybody. I totally understand that. But I do believe it's the right thing to do. I think that Smart's trying to set the right tone there. The future is still in front of UGA. And a chance to get better against Tennessee this week, that is an opportunity that does still exist for these Dogs. And that is Around the Doghouse here today, poured by our friends at Dr. Pepper. So driving home from Mississippi yesterday, stop at a spot, get a little breakfast, and I'd already had some coffee. So, I mean, I got the biggest Dr. Pepper, and I just sat there and drank that thing as Cody Chaffins was driving. I was sitting in the passenger seat and just enjoying that Dr. Pepper. I'm telling you right now, it tastes good after a big win. It tastes great after a bad loss. Dr. Pepper just goes with me on my game day weekends all the time. And, by the way, I do believe, and I don't have this fully confirmed yet, but I do believe we're going to have a huge announcement involving Dr. Pepper here this week, which I think is going to be really fun. I can't quite tell you about that today, but I want to tell you more about that because, listen, the connection that Dr. Pepper has with college football is obviously well established. Fansville commercials, me on my game weekends, you on yours. So please keep that in mind as you're getting ready for the big one against Tennessee here this weekend and perhaps some fun stuff that we're going to be dropping and telling you about. There is nobody that's more connected to college football than our friends from Dr. Pepper. So when you're thinking about enjoying some Dr. Pepper on a game day weekend, always remember, it's a Pepper thing. And, of course, we're glad to have Dr. Pepper as a part of Around the Doghouse here today. And stay tuned. I believe tomorrow we're going to have a really cool announcement courtesy of our friends at Dr. Pepper. So stay with me on that, and I'll give that to you when I am able to. But for now, the bad of the Ole Miss game, the need to sort of turn the page, and the controversy from the end of the game where some fans were critical of the body language that was caught on camera by Georgia quarterback Carson Beck. We're going to ask Jon Stinchcomb how fair some of that criticism is, too. So we're going to cover a lot of ground here. We're glad you're with us for it. Jon Stinchcomb here right now on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella, Window and Door of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Say hello to Jon Stinchcomb. And, John, in a couple of minutes, I obviously want to get into all of the not-so-pleasant moments from the game against Ole Miss on Saturday, and there were certainly plenty of those. But let me kind of begin with where I just was, that I don't think any conversation about any of this can be had without establishing the proper context that in the SEC, everybody's already lost. And as Kirby Smart pointed out, by the time the year's done, maybe everybody's also lost at least twice. That Georgia looked terrible on Saturday, but losses are not catastrophic the way they would have been in the past. You got to play better, but if you can, then in a roundabout way, it sort of gets forgotten eventually. When Georgia beat Texas, may just kind of forget about Alabama. Well, if Georgia beats Tennessee, it will in part make you forget about losing to Ole Miss. So how easy is it for, coaches and players, they'll just get right back to work. In this case, I'm more sort of asking about the fans and the mood around the game and the atmosphere that you hope to establish. How easy do you think it'll be for DawgNation to kind of get back up on the horse again and focus on the task at hand, knowing that people right now are in kind of a bad mood because Georgia did not play well on Saturday and kind of hasn't really played well for, most of this year. How difficult do you think it's going to be to establish the right mood going into the game against Tennessee on Saturday?
Yeah, I think we all have to transition. The model has changed. It's no longer you have to go undefeated to reach your goals at the end of the year or, possibly that one loss. The model's different now, like it or not. NIL, transfer portal, parity in the league, different conference alignments, longer seasons, college football playoff expansion, and the recognition that this model is much more similar to what we see in the NFL. When was the last time you saw a Super Bowl champion go undefeated throughout the year? It's been 5 decades. Was the Dolphins the only one? And that's, back when former Dawg Bill Stanfill was a part of that defensive line. So I think it's more recognition on the fans' part that things have changed. It's just like there was a professional team coming out of Atlanta who arguably is the best in their division, goes to a rival away game, and on paper they should win that game. They don't. And that's kind of what we're seeing now in college football, specifically in the SEC, is that the separation between the very best and those that are just really good, that has shrunk. And on Saturday, it was not Georgia's best performance. You watch that offense and you're going, ugh. But you have to turn the page. The coaches, the players, they're going to have an opportunity. It's almost better for them because they get to go to practice and they get to work on the stuff that they did not execute. They did not perform at a high enough level. And quite frankly, we've seen that before. So it's a good opportunity for them to kind of work that out on the practice field. And the focus is higher. The importance of the fundamentals and the details, that holds true for players and coaches. And the ask for Georgia fans is you can mourn, you can, grumble, but come Saturday, this is a big game for Georgia. It is important for the fans to show up just like it is the coaches and the players. So for us to be at our best, for Georgia to be at our best, we need our fans to be able to turn that page and be ready to make Sanford Stadium one of the most raucous, difficult environments that Tennessee has to come play in, because Georgia has certainly experienced that on the flip side, going to both Alabama and Tuscaloosa, and then most recently in Oxford. Those were hostile environments that, quite frankly, were not visitor friendly, and that's what we need on Saturday.
So I think from my perspective, if I'm going to have any credibility to challenge fans to be at their best on Saturday and create the kind of atmosphere that, as you said, that Georgia's been impacted by and some of its road games this season, and it seems like that's all Georgia's played is road games, then if I'm going to have credibility to challenge fans to do that, then I've got to at least be caught being honest in totality about today. So we're trying to say, hey, get ready to turn the page while also acknowledging, man, that was about as bad as it could get on Saturday. And so I want to talk to you about the thing that you probably know best in life, probably, which is, how you perform effectively on the offensive line. And Jon, it's just, it's shocking to me, how below the standard Georgia has been with its offensive line from what I expected this group to be. And all of these players, I think I like individually. It's just not quite coming together collectively right now the way that I expected it to. Of course, the Micah Morris and Tate Ratledge injury impacts some of this, but I don't know that it fully explains all of this. You know this so well. Why do you think the Georgia offensive line play on Saturday was such a problem, and why has it been so far below what many of us hoped and thought it would be here for this year? What's going on here, Jon?
Yeah, there's been a regression, and quite pointedly, this was not an anomaly. The offensive line performance this season has not been great. It has been the Joe Moore Award is safe. We don't have to worry about that coming to Athens this year. And there needs to be a challenge on that front to step their game up, whether it was accolades coming into the season where there was pats on the back and maybe we thought we were better than certainly what we've performed so far. The performance on Saturday was only exacerbated because Ole Miss's defensive front is really good. And let's give credit where credit is due. Their front tore Georgia a new one. And they were outperformed, they were out-efforted, out-executed, top to bottom. Better technique, better execution. Georgia's front was whipped in a way that we haven't seen in this Kirby Smart era. And were it me, if I'm in that room, I take great umbrage towards that. And I have to own it and come into this week going, we have to get better, because this was not an anomaly. This was just only accentuated because Ole Miss is better than most fronts that we've seen. You can't put it on one single player. It wasn't like, hey, because of Tate Ratledge injury, because Micah Morris not being available. No excuses, because all five of them. I watched again and again on Sunday the replay of that game, and you're going left tackle to right tackle, both guards and center. There's multiple plays where you just get whipped. Whether it's assignment, whether it's technique, whether you're just not on the same page across the board, it's not good enough. And for all those that have put so much on Carson Beck's plate, and granted, he's probably earned a lot of it, it certainly wasn't the case on Saturday. You don't put that game on Carson Beck having watched the film. You put it on the offensive line. You can put it on the wide receivers. The fact that we continue to lead all of college football and dropped catches is a huge problem. So that's not Carson Beck. That's not the quarterback. That's offensive line execution. We're not able to unload some of that pressure from Carson by running the ball well. Put that on Nate Frazier and his inability to hold the ball. You look good for 10 yards. If you give them the ball at the end of that 10, it doesn't help us. So every player on that offense needs to take ownership. And the same can hold true on the flip side. Same thing for the defense, with the secondary needing to step up, with the defensive line needing to perform like they did against Texas and make that the standard instead of the exception. So there's plenty of opportunity, and that's the good news. For this Georgia team, there is opportunity to get better. But right now, what they've shown in this stretch of 5-6 games is that the standard is lower and not being met to what Georgia has consistently established in years past.
So at the risk of asking too simplistic of a question, honestly, I probably need for it to be simple so I can understand it. After the Kentucky game, there was talk about poor communication, and that caused Georgia some issues there. A lot of people shared some insight, I believe you did too, that they just weren't communicating effectively, and perhaps maybe some of that started with Senator Jared Wilson. But either way, there was just not good communication taking place. So Was this on Saturday a communication issue made more difficult because of a loud Ole Miss crowd? Was this just physical dominance of, guys like Princely and Walter Nolan just being so elite athletically and size that, hey, physically they're just beating you physically? Was this a technique thing where, Georgia was taking a sloppy approach to blocking really effective Ole Miss, pass rushers? If you had to say poor communication, poor technique, or just better physical specimens on the other side, of those three choices, what was the bigger culprit for you on Saturday?
I'd like to be able to answer yes, BA, because all of it was an issue. I personally think when you go up against a really talented team, you need to rely on your fundamentals. You need to rely on the technique that you've trained for. The reason why you start working out when the season ends in January and getting ready for training camp in August and July is for games like what we played on Saturday. You don't prepare for the teams that you can beat. You don't prepare for the guy that you're better than, either physically or just more talented. You prepare for guys that are going to test you. And Ole Miss was that test. Their defensive front is really good. And when you don't have the fundamentals, when you don't have the technique, when you haven't honed your skills in communication for road games, and we're on the same page, and I don't care if it's Bobo coming in or Tate returning from an injury where he's not been available for 4 weeks, and you're on the – to me, those are excuses. To me, the whole time that you've been preparing, it's for occasions like what we saw on Saturday. We're playing against the very best that you're going to face and being ready for it. And when you get by just I'm better than you up to this point, and you don't have to work on your technique, and you don't have to be on the same page, and you've got a running back like Etienne or Frazier that can make a linebacker that's unblocked miss in the hole in past games, you're going, oh, okay, well, we get away with that. When you go up against an Ole Miss, you don't get away with it. You don't get away with not being on the same page, whether it's protection or in the run game on a simple inside zone, and we don't know who we're comboing with or to. Those things that we've gotten away with in the past because individual battles were just better than you, that doesn't work when the defensive front is as good, and in this case, better than we were up front. Their energy was better, their technique was better, their execution was better. And so it comes down to the fundamentals, yes, of just the technique, of how we're going to do it. But this wasn't a 1 week isolation incident. This was what we've seen in the past that we were just able to overcome. And Ole Miss up front especially was better than Georgia's offensive front. And that's the challenge, is that, there's a whole lot to clean up between Saturday to Saturday. And Tennessee is no slouch. And it's a game that Georgia has to have for us to continue towards those goals. So, for me, you got to work on the fundamentals, but you also have to work on just the overall execution. And that involves the technique, that involves the communication, and it certainly involves the effort.
So I don't pretend to know more than I do, but I'm watching the game as close as anybody else, and just you sort of can't help but make observations, even if you're not a former player, not a former coach. You're still going to make these observations. And when I look at the Georgia offensive game plan from Saturday, what it looks like to me is that Georgia, knowing it had a struggling quarterback, came in with a pretty careful game plan to not put the ball in harm's way after there had been way too many interceptions, hoping that you could lean on the running game to kind of take some of the pressure off of Beck. And when the running game didn't work, the passing plays that Georgia was mostly calling were just kind of too short and too safe to have any real impact. You're not going to gash the Ole Miss defense calling as high a number of sort of short, safe passes that Georgia was calling when you had no real running game to pair that with. And so essentially you were doing nothing offensively. You weren't throwing it or running it. And if not for a short field to begin the game, you probably wouldn't have scored a touchdown at all. That's my observation of what I saw. How fair of a description do you believe that is?
I think that's accurate. I think the Frazier fumble, where that was the one drive that looked like they were going to sustain and end in points, where We didn't have to get it on the 21 and convert on a 4th down to get a touchdown. It ends in a fumble. So you're going, man, that's frustrating. But I do think it starts with the run game. If you're able to run, it switches with what the defense can do and has to do. If they're able to get pressure on the quarterback by just bringing 4 guys, that's a problem. Georgia recognized pretty early on that that's not a matchup that we're winning. We need to be able to run the game. We need to be able to threaten Ole Miss and change up what they do so we can open up our offense more. Georgia wasn't able to establish it. We weren't able to establish the run. And because of it, I think in defense of Coach Bobo, in defense of Carson Beck, he was under duress. So you have a couple of options. You can either run the screen game, run the short passing game to get the ball out quick, try to put the onus on the other players and soften up the defense in those ways, which is what Georgia did. Or you try to bring in extra protection, 7-man protection, a lot more play action to create more opportunities down the field. But that comes with trust in the 2 wide receivers that are out running those routes that they can get open. What I saw watching the film again is Ole Miss was able to play with those safeties deep. And when you play with 2 high, you're not able to take those shots because that's what the defense is aligned and powered to do. They are trying to eliminate those big play shot plays from Georgia. They're discouraging Georgia from even taking it. So based on what Ole Miss was running and based on what Georgia was not able to execute, the best option available was the short to less than intermediate pass game, screens, all those things to try to soften it up, to try to change what they were doing. And it was ineffective, mainly because of drop passes and mainly because of execution up front. So, would you have liked to see Georgia open it up more? Yes, they couldn't do it. Carson was under duress. He was pressured every time he dropped back. So I think ultimately, where does that start? It starts with being able to run the ball effectively and hold on to the ball when you do it. And Georgia wasn't able to do that on Saturday.
I got one more topic I want to address with you before we let you go. Let me give a shout-out before we get there. Our friends at the Finish Long Drink. Obviously, folks getting ready for a fun tailgate coming up on Saturday. A lot of holiday parties coming up after that, too. Finish Long Drink goes great with that, whether you're talking about the long drink. Cranberry, the peach-flavored version for limited time in the Peach State. The traditional citrus, that's the blue can. The grapefruit flavor, the gin kick. Long Drink Zero, no carbs, no sugar. A lot to like about the Finish Long Drink. And as you're getting ready for a fun time of year with holiday parties and get-togethers and tailgates and hopefully a lot of fun for Georgia, even still going to the college football playoff and all of that. Let the Finish Long Drink be a big part of that. It comes from Helsinki from back in the 1950s when the Summer Games were there in Finland. And now it's been in America for a few years, and it's been a big part of DawgNation for a long time, too. So check out thelongdrink.com for more on that. You can find out where you can get some and make it a big part of a big tailgate prior to a fun game against Tennessee on Saturday. The Finish Long Drink. Make it a part of your game day and all of your days as you head towards a really fun holiday time of year. Check out the Finish Long Drink here today. All right, John, I don't even know how aware you are of this, but I do want to get your perspective as a former player and a guy who spends a lot of time on sidelines, happy moments, sad moments, everything in between, that a lot of fans kind of jumped on a moment late in the game on Saturday where Carson Beck was sort of seen smiling on the sidelines more than some folks would have liked. He got picked up. The photo that I'm showing here on the screen comes from the Unnecessary Roughness account. That's one of the Barstool accounts for their college football show. It's Beck. He's smiling. A lot of folks kind of grabbed that right away. He's sitting next to Jaden Rashada, which is important because for some additional context, Rashada's father, who's pretty active on social media, was kind of describing the event here that makes it sound a little bit different than what some fans sort of initially thought that it was. I think we have the Harlan Rashada statement here. He says, I'm sure there have been countless times that Carson has picked up Jaden Rashada, so this brings joy to my heart to see the bond of 2 elite competitors. He means his son Jaden and obviously Carson Beck, holding strong in a moment of defeat. He says that's real brotherhood. Heavy is the head that wears the crown, but we ain't done. In Rashada's post, he sort of showed the image of Beck not smiling prior to this and then smiling after that, kind of almost – it sort of seems like a post coming to the defense without mentioning it of Beck for the criticism that he's gotten. One of the things we try to be a little bit careful about here, John, is making too big of a deal about body language, because I think that sometimes that sort of thing can be misleading. What gets captured on camera is not always the full picture. We have a lot of examples of that. I mean, listen, obviously this was noticeable to me too when it was first described to me, and I think my knee-jerk reaction is, I don't love that. I do think the additional context matters, and perhaps extending some grace to someone who, if you get caught on camera in what's maybe not your absolute best moment, hey, let's maybe have a little bit of forgiveness and grace for that, maybe not make too big of a deal about that. You're on sidelines a lot. I don't know if you ever got caught on camera, maybe at a time in which you didn't want to be. But what do you make of the criticism of Beck for what seemed to be, in the eyes of some, a little too happy of a demeanor in the midst of a pretty bad performance for his team?
Yeah, I've seen that. Aaron Brooks was the quarterback for the New Orleans Saints when I first got there, and I felt like the cameras would look for him to smile after an interception or those kinds of things because it fit a narrative that fans thought he was laissez-faire when it came to the importance of games and the importance of executing. And so I'm almost sensitive to that of what's a player's demeanor afterwards. I didn't see Carson joking and shucking and grinning and having the time of his life on the sideline. He's smiling. And I do think it's one of those situations where it's a teammate, it's a friend who's trying to lift him up and say, something so that he doesn't go in the tank. And I didn't personally, I watched it. I saw that very incident. I saw the camera cut to him and there's a smile on his face. I didn't interpret that as I don't care. And that's the concern that fans have is, does he not care that the game isn't going well? Does he not care about the turnovers over the past however many plays? And that was not what I read from the smile on his face, nor from how he plays. It's not like he goes like, all right, well, there was another one. Who gives a rip? It's similar to after the Florida game where his post-game comments were kind of scrutinized and picked through. And I've had a number of people bring those up to me, but I don't think that any of that, whether it's the smile or post-game comments following the Florida game, indicates that he doesn't care, that he isn't committed, that he's not focused, that he doesn't it doesn't matter to him that Georgia didn't play well on Saturday and that the turnovers keep happening. And it's because we're bitter. It's because all of us, Georgia fans, we want more from this team. We want them to perform well. That we start looking into stuff a little harder, even when there's not a lot there. And from that smile that I saw that the camera caught on the sideline, I don't think there's a lot there. I don't think that was an indicator that he is laissez-faire, that he doesn't really care what's happening and that Georgia isn't performing really well. That's not my takeaway. My takeaway is that it was a teammate trying to lift a brother up on the sideline. Do they need to play better? Yes. Do we need to eliminate turnovers? Yes. Do we need to be able to get off the field and stop teams and be able to rely on our defense, which we have for a number of times, including this season? Yes, we do. Does our offense performance need to step up? Yes, it does. But the smile between two teammates following a lackluster offensive performance, to me, was not an indicator that our point man, our quarterback, doesn't care or isn't engaged.
Jon, I think that's really well said, and I'm glad that we got a chance to talk about that, and I appreciate your insight on everything else, too. And hopefully the next time we get together, it's a much happier discussion about a much better Georgia performance and what would be a very big win against Tennessee, and this team's got the capability of doing it if they can just find a way to put it together. So thanks for your insight here today. Enjoy your week, and we'll catch up again very soon here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia.
I appreciate it, BA. Look forward to Dawgs showing the Vols what it's about to be in Sanford Stadium and play in a big SEC contest on our own home ground. So looking forward to it.
Totally agree, Jon. Thanks for your time.
Appreciate it.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
All right, for like 2 seconds, I'm about to be very corny. Now, I'm pretty corny all the time. I don't dispute that. I've never been very good at being cool. but I'm going to be corny here for a second. Like, I think it's really important that Georgia fans, as I said before, you want to create the right atmosphere for Saturday, and you sort of want to create the environment where this team can shake off a really bad performance against Ole Miss. And I don't think there's any more important sort of spot for the focal point of all this other than the relationship that Georgia fans have with Carson Beck here right now. I really, really think that extending him some grace, extending him some courtesy, some generosity, I just think that would go a really long way. And, I mean, I would love nothing more than when the starting lineups are announced on Saturday. And listen, I know how corny this is. I realize I'm just so out of step. I know how corny this is, but I'm going to say it anyway. I would love nothing more as a statement about what the atmosphere is going to be on Saturday and the way in which DawgNation wants to sort of get behind its team for a big game. I'd love for the ovation for Beck when he's announced as the starter on Saturday to be louder than it's ever been. I just love that. Man, I would love that so much. I mean, I would love to see DawgNation back for this game on Saturday and really let it be known that, I mean, one way or another, Georgia's hopes for the remainder of the season are pinned on Carson Beck. And if he has played big games before and played well before, well, of course, it's possible that he could do that again. And if he does, Georgia favored to win on Saturday, will be favored to beat Georgia Tech. This is a team that still has a very good chance of being in the college football playoff. Some of these teams that you could potentially be playing haven't played anybody all year long. Of course, you could win those games. But this season, it may not be a national championship. Very much might not be. But would you still want it to be as good as it possibly could be? I think you probably would. And a happy ending for Carson Beck would, I just think, still be a really good thing. So as corny as it sounds, I'd love to see DawgNation back on Saturday. I'd love to see a huge ovation when he's announced as the starter, and I'd love to kind of create the right vibe that gives him a chance, because he has had to battle hostile crowds, Ole Miss, Texas, Alabama. It seems like Georgia hasn't played a home game since, 2014 or something like that. I mean, it's been a long time since Georgia's been at home, it feels like. So let him get the feel of a friendly environment on Saturday and let that environment be as friendly as it possibly can. I'd love for that to happen. I hope the Georgia fans respond. Let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Let's get really excited about everything that Royal Caribbean has in store for the upcoming year. We're kind of coming up on that sort of like Black Friday sale time, and Royal Caribbean's right there with you on all that too. And this is a great time to talk to Jessica Slater, because obviously I hope that you're with us in the DawgNation Cruise. The DawgNation Cruise is a little bit different than what I'm talking about here, because the DawgNation Cruise is sort of a block of rooms we kind of hold on to, and I know there's limited space on that, but kind of folks getting involved and kind of doing that sort of a special kind of that's a little bit of a different type of travel booking. But if you're thinking about whether it be spring break, early, I love cruising in the wintertime if you get a chance to do that. If you're thinking about those kinds of things, the Black Friday time of year coming up on the holiday season around November is a great time to get some of the best savings that Royal Caribbean offers on any cruise at any point in time of the year. And the sooner you book is always the better when it comes to the overall price. So if you're thinking about cruise travel at any point in time in 2025, talking to Jessica Slater about that right now with Royal Caribbean is a great way to get the best possible savings. So give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com, and she'll tell you everything you need to know about all of that. All right, let's go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And credit where credit's due, it was a dominant win for Alabama against LSU on Saturday. And I sort of feel like we got this one right in that we said, hey, you've got a quarterback in Jalen Milroe who's kind of won big games before, a coach in Kalen DeBoer who, even in a kind of relatively short tenure as a head coach, has also won some big games. We were going to lean on that in Baton Rouge against a Garrett Nussmeier who really hasn't done those kinds of big game performances. By the way, there's a great job by our staff putting together the package here for the game. You see Omar Bradley, the Tiger for LSU, ultimately not really paying off much in the way of dividends there. Just funny to look up and see that. But, Nussmeier not really had the big game performance before. Brian Kelly as a coach, not really had the big wins as being at LSU. And it didn't sort of feel like that was kind of the difference here right now, that Alabama is just a more battle-tested program in moments like this, and they did not flinch about being in Death Valley on Saturday night. And perhaps in one respect, this is instructive for Georgia fans because, Alabama was down bad as you could be after losing to Tennessee, losing to Vanderbilt, but they totally shook that off in this game against LSU. And all of a sudden now, the vibe after 2 losses, it just feels completely different. And y'all, it can be the same thing for Georgia too. It really can. I'm not trying to be trite. I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish, or y'all always talk about Disney dogs. I'm not trying to be too Disney doggish. But if Bama can shake off 2 losses and be riding high right now, then why couldn't Georgia do the same thing? Why couldn't that also happen for Georgia? It clearly could, but Alabama, to its credit, that was a very, very strong performance. And Jalen Milroe, to his credit, found a great time to have one of his best overall games. He is so dangerous with his legs. He really is. It's just an extra dimension. And I think that right now, it's a crowded crop of quarterbacks here in the SEC. We've obviously given Diego Pavia from Vanderbilt a lot of credit. But right now, Milroe is sort of giving you a reminder of why perhaps he ought to be sort of thought of as best quarterback in the SEC. And in that conversation for best overall quarterback in the country, Milroe picked a very good time to have a very big game. Conversely, for Brian Kelly, this is a tough loss because, you're talking about now this is year 3 for him. And I'm not talking about getting fired. He's not getting fired. He's not going anywhere. But the previous 3 coaches at LSU all won national championships. Orgeron did, Les Miles did, Nick Saban did. It is a national championship standard at LSU, and frankly, that's the only reason that Kelly took the job. He had done kind of everything at Notre Dame he was going to be able to do. He'd made the playoff a couple of times, but they didn't have access to the sort of talent there that gave you a real chance to win a national championship. And you come to Baton Rouge for that reason. And frankly, here we are, coming towards the end of his 3rd year. He's not any closer to winning a national championship at LSU than when he started. Now, the big thing is we probably haven't talked about this enough on our show because it doesn't really overlap with Georgia at all. But we've got a quarterback in the class of 2025 named Bryce Underwood who is as touted as any quarterback I can remember in the last couple of years. He is what a lot of people, I think, thought Juju Lewis was going to be, but the hype train for Lewis never really quite got started. Underwood sort of is that guy. He is commanding seemingly a major NIL bidding war. And right now it seems like Underwood's going to go to LSU. Michigan somehow, some way is a factor in all of this, maybe spending very big dollars. I don't know if those are Dave Portnoy dollars or not, but that Michigan wants to be a factor in the Underwood recruitment. But much like Billy Napier sort of used DJ Lagway as a way of selling hope and promise to Florida fans, like right now, Underwood sort of is what Brian Kelly has. But this was a pretty tough loss for Kelly in the manner that it happened, getting beaten as badly as they did, big home environment, the live tiger, all of the stuff around the game. And LSU just got dragged by Alabama. Strong performance by Bama, and really kind of a tough one there for Brian Kelly. Tennessee, Georgia's opponent for this upcoming Saturday, they do beat Mississippi State. But the question after the game surrounds the status of Vols quarterback Nico Iamaleava, who did leave the game for Tennessee and did not come back in. And it was early enough, the game was still in doubt enough, Tennessee wasn't necessarily great against Mississippi State, that a lot of folks are kind of questioning Iamaleava's status for the game against Georgia on Saturday. Josh Heupel after the game saying this was all precautionary. We think he could have come back in. The score, the scenario would make you wonder how true that really is. But if you want to start getting geared up for this game on Saturday, one of the things we're going to get geared up around is just how healthy is Nico. I think one of the real stories for Tennessee has been that Nico, in his first year as a starter, but second year in the program after commanding major NIL dollars, we're told, has really not been great. He's not even really necessarily been good. In a 16-team league, I think he's been somewhere around the median SEC quarterback, not really in the top half of quarterbacks in this league, I don't believe. I think Carson Beck's had a better year than Nico, for instance. It's just not been a great year for him, but obviously any chance that Tennessee has to beat Georgia, a healthy Nico would go a long way towards getting that done. So we're going to be watching his status very closely. And I'm also going to mention this. So now as we kind of move through November, it's about to get really complicated as far as some of these playoff scenarios go. So look at the SEC here for a moment, where, I mean, frankly, I almost don't even really care who plays in the SEC championship because it's so inconsequential to who actually wins the national championship. And I say that as someone who's always loved the SEC championship game. But clearly we are moving into an era in which the SEC championship means less than who makes the 12-team playoff. But if you want to think about, like, the SEC championship participants being the first two SEC teams make the playoff, then that's probably a decent way to think about this. And the simple, easy scenario is, well, if Texas were to keep winning, they would get in, almost like an old-school SEC West winner. And if Tennessee were to beat Georgia on Saturday, then beat Vanderbilt, they would sort of make it in. It's kind of an old-school SEC East winner. Like, there is a way for a very neat, clean, and tidy SEC championship. If Tennessee and Texas both keep winning, they're going to go and play in Atlanta in December, and it's going to feel a lot like what SEC seasons have felt like in the past. But I think we would all kind of assume here that either Texas or Tennessee will each lose a game before the season is done. They may both still lose a game before the season is done. Kirby Smart was right when he alluded to that in his post-game press conference on Saturday. And if you get into, like, the whole bunch of, like, 6-2 teams, boy, it gets really messy pretty fast. It does. It just gets really messy. Tiebreakers to make the SEC championship gets really convoluted, as I said before. I don't care about that as much as I care about which teams would have the inside track for the playoff. And here's what I'm going to tell you. As bad of a mood as many of you are about Georgia today, with good reason, after a really stinky performance against Ole Miss, if you're 10-2 at the conclusion of the regular season with a blowout win against Clemson, road win against Texas, win against Tennessee, another non-conference Power 4 win against Georgia Tech, if that's what your resume is, then Georgia ought to roller skate its way into the playoff. Now, whether they will or they won't kind of comes down to a committee that's ultimately going to do whatever it wants to do and make up its reasoning for do it after the fact. We all know that. But Georgia at 10-2 would have, I think, an airtight argument for making the college football playoff. What happens around that, I don't know. But Georgia ought to be in this playoff at 10-2, and I believe they probably would be. Now, what does that mean for other SEC teams such as Bama and Ole Miss that would have beaten Georgia, or Texas, who Georgia would have beaten? I don't know. But I'm here to tell you that Georgia, ought to make that case. And I think it's not too soon to start thinking about, when you look at somehow, some way, the SEC and the Big Ten are apparently competing for the same number of playoff bids, despite the fact that teams like Penn State and Indiana haven't beaten a ranked team all year long. Indiana played its best opponent to date on Saturday, Michigan, and barely won the game. People are treating the SEC and the Big Ten as if they are leagues of a similar caliber, but on the field, that could not be less true. At least it seems like to me. Like, that's a really complicated conversation that I feel like we need to have more than we're having right now. It'll be interesting to see how Miami's loss impacts the ACC's attempt to maybe get a second team in. Colorado's win, what that does to the Big 12. It's about to get very interesting. Playoff rankings come out again tomorrow night. They will come out late because it's that college basketball weekend they do every year. But nonetheless, the playoff scenario is going to get very, very complicated, as a lot of these very crowded leagues have a lot of very, very messy tiebreaker situations. The SEC, an example of that, too, and we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, let me give you a shout-out to our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau here for a moment. Listen, everybody has to have insurance. Legally, when it comes to your auto insurance, you definitely have to have it. It's against the law not to. So making the right choice about who you use for your insurance provider, you could perhaps use a lot of different criteria to sort of make that decision. Here's one of the things I can tell you. I would want to work with a company that I know cares about me. And we've been talking forever now about Georgia Farm Bureau, the care they have done at a cost to them, by the way, to support Georgia's farmers and all of our agricultural community after the terrible storms have kind of ripped through Georgia and created unimaginable damage to our crops and our farmland and our community. Georgia Farm Bureau has stepped up in a big way on that because they love Georgians. And they love the food that Georgians eat. And they don't want to just take care of Georgia's farmers and their agricultural community. They want to take care of all of you, too, because they're living and working and going to their high school football games and all the other stuff. They're doing all of that on a weekly basis in our state, just like you are. That means it's friendly agents. It's kind claims adjusters. It's people who really kind of know what your life is like because their lives are just like yours, and they want to serve you from an insurance standpoint. So choose them for your home insurance, your auto insurance. Let them be your insurance provider and let them provide you the quality care that comes from a group that's always the home team. That's what Georgia Farm Bureau is. So give them a call today, 877 let me say that one more time if you don't mind. 877-404-1050. That's 877-404-1050. Also, you can email them, not email them, on the line, the website, gfbinsurance.com. That's gfbinsurance.com. All right, Golden Shoe today. Obviously, we're still sad about Eddie's absence. We're going to put that aside today because people aren't really in the mood for that. But I thought I got a good Golden Shoe submission from a guy we've given Golden Shoes before, and I think this strikes the right note. So many of you know the British Bulldog, who famous fan, traveled over here from the UK to go to a Georgia game, and a lot of y'all like him and follow him, and he seems like a great guy. He shared a photo from Sunday, beautiful photo with his young child with unbelievable scenery in the back. And Bodog writes in to say, "Love this." He's basically responding to this X post. The sun came up today in the UK and here in Georgia. We pulled out our Power G window flag this morning as we left the house at 8:45 and watched it wave proudly as we drove back home. Remembering from past games when Georgia lost, the point of all this is that even after a tough loss, it's still a great thing to be a Georgia fan. I'll tell you this real quick. As we were coming back from Mississippi yesterday and seeing all the Georgia fans who were kind of doing the same type of deal, you get up, you make that long drive, you're licking your wounds there a little bit. But as we stopped, like Buc-ee's and things like that, I saw a lot of pride in a lot of those Georgia fans who were still walking around, still dressed in the red and black, and still as optimistic as they could be about what's still left to come. And so I think the Bodog does a good job at that. And I appreciate British Bulldog for sharing a nice photo there, too. So we'll give them Golden Shoes for that here today. We'll also remind you, lousy, stinking Gators is even worse for them than it ever is for Georgia. 1,465 days. That's how long it's been since Florida has beaten Georgia. That's our Gator Hater Updater. We'll see all of you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that. All right, so I'm going to run through some comments here. We'll kind of find out what's on folks' mind here as Georgia tries to shake off one bad loss and have some optimism about the hopes of getting a big win coming up on Saturday. So UGA boy for life Brunetti says with the SEC schedule, you got nothing left for the playoffs. With the Big Ten, it only comes down to basically a 2-on-2 horse show. Yeah, I mean, look, I think it is pretty frustrating right now that you've got essentially what by all appearances is like 8 SEC teams competing for 4 spots and 4 Big Ten teams kind of playing at even close to a playoff level. Like, I don't care about Penn State and Indiana's record at all. Those records don't impress me whatsoever. Indiana being undefeated, Penn State only having the 1 loss. Neither has beaten a ranked opponent. In the case of Indiana, I mean, I guess they'll get their chance against Ohio State coming up at some point in time, but they're going to lose the one game of any magnitude, and somehow claim they still belong in the college football playoff even after that. Like, that's just ludicrous to me. It's absolutely ludicrous. And if Georgia loses to Tennessee, it's not going to matter. I mean, at that point, Georgia, I'm guessing, has probably lost its playoff chance. But, and I blame Greg Sankey for some of this because it has just been this ongoing conversation that the SEC and the Big Ten, these are the 2 big leagues right now. But somehow that doesn't seem to match up the balance between these 2 leagues, both as the big money conferences. That doesn't seem to match up with what we're currently seeing on the field, the overall quality and depth of the SEC in comparison to what we're seeing in the Big Ten. That doesn't seem to be matching up there. Let's go comparing Joe Cox throwing interceptions to Carson Beck. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, some of that comes from the fact that Georgia's just throwing it so much right now. I mean, I get the point that you're making, but I don't know. Look, I know it's corny. I know it's silly probably, but, man, I just want to give a lot of grace to Carson. I want to see people get behind Carson just for this week. And if it does go well this week, then I guess after that you can do what you want. But for this week, I'd love to see people get behind Carson and really back him going into Saturday to kind of get the back, phenomenon going and just really give him a chance to have a better game and a home crowd and perhaps a happier ending to a story that seems to be playing out here right now. Like, I get the point that you're making. I do. I do get that. JG on the subject of Greg Sankey. Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm not super happy with Sankey's leadership right now. I'm not. I think it's a complicated topic, but I think that Sankey has unnecessarily ceded ground over to the Big Ten. And I think that whatever made Sankey such a great leader in 2020, really recognizing that his sport, football, obviously he's commissioner for everything, but football is the one that matters more than anything else, that his sport was in a precarious spot where people were trying to step in and cancel the season. He wouldn't let them. And I think that Sankey has sort of missed the mark since then on the same kind of chaos that was trying to be imposed on college football then. Sankey recognized it, defended against it. I think there are a bunch of people that are trying to impose a similar level of chaos here right now, just using a different tactic. And somehow he's not as forceful in his defense of this because it's not as, I would say the enemy's not quite as well defined. But also, I think that he's, to me, too interested in how can you squeeze out like $5 million more per year for SEC teams, while the competitive edge that his league once enjoyed and the respect that came with that is kind of eroding. That's probably more complicated than we have a chance to get into right now. Foster Moss says, how about we use some of those freshman wide receivers? What's the worst that could happen? Like my high school coach used to say, because I ain't going to die with no senior. So, look, let's talk about that for a moment on two fronts. Here's thing number one. Most of us would have spent most of the year saying, why isn't Georgia playing Nate Frazier more? Why isn't Georgia playing Nate Frazier more? Well, Saturday, I think you saw part of the reason why some Georgia fans wanted to see Nate Frazier more. There were moments on Saturday when Frazier had some really good runs and got some really tough yards for Georgia. But he also coughed it up, twice? One of those turned into a turnover, and one of them could have. And so I think you saw evidence of why Georgia fans had wanted to see Frazier in the game. He is potentially a dynamic playmaker. But I think you also saw why Kirby Smart was a little hesitant to sometimes use him, because as a freshman, his ball security seemed to be a little bit of an issue. And so when you think about other freshmen that are not playing, I think that's probably a reminder that there probably is a good reason why some of them are not playing right now. And look, at a certain point, I do believe this is a conversation we need to have, which is if you compare a very big difference between Ole Miss and Georgia on Saturday. And listen, I totally acknowledge that forever I've been saying that high school recruiting is better than portal recruiting. There's just a better mechanism for roster construction, talent acquisition. I probably still think that's true, I guess. But when you are a heavy high school recruiting team, and presumably, I mean, I think would assume that every major recruiting battle, the likes of which that Georgia wins, they all have some in a NIL component to it. You're not getting these players in this day and age if you're not. It's not all $1 million like so-and-so, but, there's an NIL component to every recruiting battle in this day and age. We would just assume that's the case. So I think the question you have to ask yourself is, in contrast to Ole Miss, how much money is Georgia paying for players that aren't really playing very much? And is that essentially just sort of dead money when it comes to this team this year? Now, I think that Georgia probably looks at it as a little bit of an investment into its future of guys that can help you in the future. But when you don't quite have enough right now to win a game like the game that Georgia played on Saturday, I do think it makes you wonder, well, gosh, could some of this money have been spent on players who were more ready to make an immediate impact? That's what Ole Miss did. And there was a risk associated with that. When you go out and spend on Princely and Walter Nolan and all the guys that Ole Miss brought in, listen, they could have gotten hurt. They could have pouted after a couple of losses and sort of checked out. Obviously, there's always going to be some chance of that with a transfer-laden team. There's a risk associated with doing this. There's no free lunch, but it also might work. And in this particular case, the gamble paid off. And I think there's a way of looking at Saturday, Ole Miss versus Georgia, and saying these two teams may have similar NIL payrolls right now, but Ole Miss is spending a lot of dollars on players who are currently helping them, and Georgia may be, I'm just guessing here because none of this stuff is truly known, they may be spending a decent amount of money on players that are just too inexperienced to be effective right now. And, I mean, I think that somebody somewhere should be asking, well, gosh, is that the best use of our overall NIL budget? That, we've talked about 5-star this and 4-star that. The real line of demarcation for recruits might be who can help me right now and who can't. And if you're a guy that has a million accolades and an offer from every school in the book, but if you're not quite good enough to play right now, I mean, I do have to wonder, like, how valuable are you truly? That, I mean, college football is sort of becoming a year-to-year sport. And I don't know how much anybody's sort of building for the future anymore. And so if your budget for one given year goes to what you hope you can achieve in a future year, who's to say that player even sticks around anyway? So, I mean, I do think at a certain point, there's got to be a little bit of a reckoning of, how well Georgia is playing the game based on what the rules are right now. The previous system, 2021 and 2022, as we've said before, a lot of Georgia fans believe that Georgia won the last true national championships based on what college football used to be. A lot of Georgia fans believe that. And I don't think they're necessarily wrong. But now you're kind of forced to play the game as it is right now. And I do think when you look at aggressive NIL, aggressive portal team like Ole Miss. And I totally realize this is me changing my tune based on what I've said in the past. And I'm not even saying that, I'm flip-flopping and I'm, want to see Georgia go portal crazy. That's really not what I'm saying. I am saying when a team who approaches its business so differently than Georgia has year-over-year transformation playing against Georgia, you at least have to notice that. I think you at least have to notice it. Bo White says the offensive line and receivers the biggest problem. Beck has no time to throw the ball. The whole team needs to give him some help. No alpha player. Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with really very much of that here right now. Jonathan Aaron asking about the squirrel that ran on the field on Saturday. Obviously we've asked those questions too, and eventually we're going to talk more about that. I try to stay away from like Eddie content today because I don't know that people are necessarily in a great mood for that right now, but couldn't help but notice that. And we're going to do an investigation on that and try to figure out there you go. This is the squirrel. I think we can confirm this is not Eddie because there is no blindfold. So I think from that standpoint, I think we can probably confirm that this isn't Eddie, but was this somehow in connection with Eddie? We are going to try to investigate this, and we'll see what we can find out about that. And great job by our team for getting that up there on the screen. A zoomed-in close-up, I think, does confirm that is not Eddie the Blind Squirrel, so thank you. JCP on the regression of the offense wants to put the blame on Mike Bobo, and all I can tell you is you may be right about that, the same way that people want to blame Carson Beck. But can we just hold off on that for a little while? Can we give Georgia a chance to play better on Saturday? I mean, we just don't get that many moments where you get the big home environment and the big chance to create a wonderful experience. We just don't get that many chances of that. Can we have that for Saturday? I would certainly like for there to be. But I get the idea that people are a little bit frustrated, and I want to create space for people to talk about that. I get all of that. My wish, and maybe this is, goofy, but my wish is that we could give some space for a good game on Saturday, and let's see if we still feel this way at the end of next week, at the end of the season. Let's just sort of see. That's what I would hope. Lynn Shipman also asking about Eddie. The only contact we've had with Eddie recently is a couple of days ago around the C.J. Wiley commitment. Other than that, we have not heard much from Eddie. But I do believe that I expect to hear more in the near future, Lynn. That's what I can tell you. I do expect to hear more in the near future. Greg Childers and Ward Campbell talking about Bobo in here saying, I've watched Bobo's offense half my life. He never wins a big game. Look, I all I can say is I get the frustration. And, we're not going to censor those type of topics. We're going to let people say what they want to say. And, I'm not going to pretend that my opinion ought to have more weight than anybody else's does. My personal opinion is I want to leave some room to be impressed with what Georgia does in the final couple of games that has. The Tennessee one, obviously the most important because it's the next one. I want to leave some room for the chance that we might be impressed right there. Scott Gentry on the offensive line. Yeah, there are a couple of images that come out from Saturday. Like I saw one photo where it's a running play, and I think it's Cash Jones who's running it. There's not an Ole Miss defensive lineman being blocked. Jones has got it, and it's a jailbreak. Just everybody coming right at him. There's some pretty rough images coming out of that game in terms of just how dominant Ole Miss was at that point of attack. Bill Sanders says, hold off on it. It's been 10 games of this. It isn't like this is the first 2 or 3 games. It's 10 games of the season. Isn't that enough? So, obviously, I respect Bill. He's a great commenter. But what I would say in response to that is if that's true today, it'll even be more true after next week. If it's so true, it'll even be more true after next week. So could we just wait a week to make the point? Could we just wait a week to make the point? Because, no matter how you get to 10-2, if you could get to 10-2 against this schedule, I think in a roundabout way, you should probably feel okay about that. It is not a pretty thing to watch right now offensively. I get that. I do get that. But if you could get to 10-2, doesn't that soften some of this? Or whether it's around Beck or around Bobo or whatever else. And I am more than happy to take the arrows that are going to come my way for saying this. I'm not saying ignore what your eyes are seeing. And I'm not going to try to use a phrase you probably hear too much in the media sometimes. I am not going to try to gaslight you about this and make it be something that it's not. Whatever you assume you're seeing may very well be true. It might be. But would you be willing to wait a week to say, because this is a big week coming up for Georgia, and they are a 9-point favorite against Tennessee. And if they win that one, a lot of these feelings won't feel quite so intense anymore. And, there are a lot of people who thought that Georgia might be 10-2 anyway. John Gimson says he agrees with me 100%. I just think we need to leave some space that this could still be a big week for Georgia. Now, we also try to be honest about what Saturday was. We didn't try to sugarcoat it. We're not trying to, I never want to lie to y'all. But I'm also being honest when I say there were a lot of people who didn't think that Georgia could beat Texas, and they did. And they didn't play great offensively that day either. I do get that. But they still won the game. Al Chandler says how we win will also matter. I do get that. But let me also be honest with you about this. So this is just me being honest with you, sort of fan to fan and friend to friend. I sort of think of us as, all in a relationship together. Kirby won 2 national championships as recently as a year ago. So with 2 national titles, and if they go 10-2 against this schedule, he is not going to listen to a whole lot of your nitpicking about, well, yeah, but you didn't score quite as many points, and yeah, this and yeah, that. This is me being honest with you, is that we came off an election. So one of the things that you sometimes hear with an election is the idea of a mandate, that when you win an election by a certain amount of votes or a certain whatever, that if the outcome is really decisive and clear, the candidate then has a mandate of they didn't just eke by, they didn't just squeak by. They've got some additional power to put their agenda in place because of the mandate. Kirby's got 2 national titles, and if they go 10-2, he's got a mandate to do whatever he wants. And you just got to, like, this is me being honest with you, that you may be right about your critique, but Kirby will have won enough, including this year, that he's not going to listen to it. He's not going to. Doesn't mean there wouldn't be some change coming or whatever else, but there has got to be some value for winning. And it's got to be more than just money. That there's got to be some sort of quality of life that comes from winning. Otherwise, people wouldn't want to do the job. Like, for instance, like the Dallas Cowboys, for instance. They may have a, coaching search, things like that. That's thought to be sort of a broken franchise. It's not obvious anybody even really wants to coach that team right now. Like, you've got to make your job attractive for reasons other than we'll make you the highest paid coach. There's got to be some quality of life that goes along with that. And if Georgia wins, if they go 10-2, what a second season removed from 2 national championships, then the quality of life is, hey, I'm winning. I'm not gonna listen to a whole bunch of critique about how we got it done. Fairly or not, that's what the facts on the ground will be. And that's me being honest with you about that. Joseph Kennedy says we're going to have to get better players to win a national title, full stop. I mean, in a way, Joseph, you're kind of on the same wavelength of me, which is that coming off of Saturday, as opposed to bashing Beck or firing Bobo or something along those lines, if you really want to put something under the spotlight, and right now we just don't have time to do it because I'm trying to follow my own rule here of I want to try my best to sort of create the right mood for the game against Tennessee on Saturday. But if I really kind of like went off and like went down a rabbit hole, I do think some of the player acquisition stuff probably needs to be examined as much as anything right now. And I, of course, love all these Georgia players who wouldn't. There's a lot to like about them. But as I told you before, I sort of view some positions as more of a premium than others. They make a bigger impact on the game than others do. The kind of player that you bring in, whether it's a 5-star freshman or a transfer that's capable of playing right away as opposed to someone you may have to wait 2 or 3 years on. I do think there are some interesting questions to be asked about Georgia's player and talent acquisition process. And that, to me, may be more important coming off of Saturday than anything about any of the individual names, be it coach or player, and their overall performance. All right, I've got a thing I've got to do today, so let me do a couple more comments before we go. Johnny Prescott asks a very fair question. He says, where did UGA hold a personnel advantage at a position group against Ole Miss on Saturday? And, Johnny, it's shocking to say this because we don't think of Ole Miss and Georgia being equal from a talent standpoint, but on Saturday it looked unequal in the other direction. I mean, just on the basis of that game, I didn't see one area in which I thought Georgia was better than Ole Miss, and that's shocking. That's really, really shocking. It is. It's shocking that not only did Ole Miss win the game, they just sort of looked like the better team in all phases, and that Georgia was the one having to work to keep pace. This is a year after they beat them 50-something to 17 last year. I guess that Ole Miss team was probably a little bit banged up, but it's wild. Savannah Bryan says, this is my last negative comment for the week. Brian's a good guy. He says, maybe Kirby should call Lanning and ask for some advice, especially in the offensive side of the ball. Yeah, maybe. I mean, look, I don't deny that we're trying to be honest here, that, we are giving Georgia generosity about the game on Saturday against Tennessee because that's sort of what we want to come true, not necessarily because they've necessarily earned that with their play. They've been pretty bad. I think that's true. Randy Hall says Georgia must win all 3 remaining games. And, yeah, listen, that Tech game at the end of the season, now we're not going to, the Tennessee game is big enough right now. We're not going to look to it. But Tech just beat Miami. And Tech, with Buster Faulkner at the helm, did a really good job making things really hard on Georgia last year. That's no easy game. I also agree with UGA Marine, who says win out and you're in. I do really believe that. The 10-2 probably gets you there. I do believe that. DT brings up an interesting point. He says, there's a chance that the 12-team playoff might consist of Georgia and 4 teams that Georgia has played and gone 2-2 with 0 of those games being played in Athens. What he means is Clemson still could win the ACC, and the 3 teams that Georgia's played on the road could also make the playoff too. So to give you an idea of the point here is that some of what we see about Georgia is a byproduct of a really, really tough schedule. To split 4 non-home games against playoff-level teams, I mean, in a roundabout way, that's sort of doing your job. But to truly feel that way, you got to beat Tennessee on Saturday, and that's no easy feat. This Tennessee defense is really good. Johnny Prescott, an interesting theory about what Eddie may be doing right now. You see the monkeys broke out. Is Eddie doing that? I don't know. That's an interesting theory. Very interesting theory. UGA Marine also questions that of, if Eddie's driving a getaway car, how safe is that with the blindfold? Listen, I don't know. I'm hopefully we get more information on this at some point. All right, let me do a couple of final comments, then we have got to go. It's BLST says, Brandon Adams is about to make excuses for Georgia all week. So be fair just for a moment. 2 things. Maybe you joined the show late. But ultimately, I'm sort of immune to criticism. You can say whatever you want to about me. But I do ask for some fairness here. Have we not been honest about what the game was on Saturday? I mean, and I know it comes across as corny. And I said, I even own this too. When I'm saying, hey, hold off on your Beck and Bobo bashing, and let's wait a week to make some sort of like condemnation of what Georgia is. Let's let this Tennessee game play out. I know that's corny. I acknowledge that. But at the same time, I could have started the show by saying that. I mean, we spent half an hour getting into what I think was a far worse performance of the Georgia offense than it was the defense. Defense wasn't great. Offense was terrible. Did we not own that? We called out Kirby a little bit for what I think is, I mean, I hate to say it this way, but essentially lying about Georgia's offensive game plan. I feel like even if what I'm sort of saying with like the, hey, hold off on the bashing, even if that's like excessively corny, don't I earn some credibility to say that? We spend a lot of time off the top of the show acknowledging, bringing on Jon Stinchcomb here too, and acknowledging how bad all of this is. Like, isn't that at least fair that, we could do the whole show, rose-colored glasses, Disney dog style, as if we were, the official broadcast. Lesko says, okay, you're asking us to lay off Beck for a week. I'll make you a deal. If we lose Saturday and he underperforms, I need you to lay the hate on thick next Monday. Well, hopefully, I'm not going to lay hate necessarily on anybody, but I know what you mean, Lesko. So I will at least agree to this. So what Lesko says is, okay, if we're going to hold off for a week, then we need you to call it like it is next week. I mean, like, I don't know that I'm ever going to just sort of trash somebody and drag their name through the mud, especially one of the players. I don't know that I'm going to do that. But if Georgia loses again on Saturday, and if an inept offensive performance is one of the main culprits as to why, then I am more than happy to sort of say, hey, we held off for a week, we waited, and it still didn't get any better, and we'll just call it like it is. I am more than happy. I am more than happy to sort of stand back from the floodgates, whatever you want to call them, and let the conversation be whatever it is. I'm more than happy to do that. If y'all will grant me 1 week to sort of create the right mood here, assuming that Georgia doesn't win and assuming that the offense is a big reason why, I'm more than happy to let people sort of have their say. And at that point in time, then obviously based on expectations, it would have been a failed Georgia season on that side of the ball. I think I'd be okay with doing that. Does that seem like a fair trade-off? Randy Martin, thanks for the kind words. I appreciate that. Let's see what else. All right, we got to get ready to go. Yeah, super late here. Let me squeeze in one or two more. UGA Marine says positive vibes. Dog will win. Okay, so it's Veterans Day. So if UGA Marine is in our comment section, the Marine's birthday was Friday, I think. If UGA Marine is calling for positive vibes and predicting the Georgia win, if you don't align yourself with UGA Marine, you're not supporting our veterans on Veterans Day. You don't want to be that. That's just un-American. You don't want to be that. Thank you, UGA Marine. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Craig Jones mentioning a pretty good day for Tech offensively. There's no doubt about that. I do think that Buster Faulkner is doing a good job there. I do. Man, I tell you this. The Georgia offense has lost our buddy Bill Sanders. He is off. He is off the Georgia offense here right now. But, Bill, just give us a week. And I said this a moment ago. Next week, everybody will have their say. You know what we may do? We may let people even come on the show. I'll read comments. We may even take calls. I don't know. If it's bad enough, I may cede the platform over and let people have their say. We might do that. But just give me a week. Just give me a week here. Because my guess is you beat Tennessee, which Georgia is favored to do. My guess is that people will feel just a little bit better. That's my guess. But we shall see. We shall see. All right, so y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. They get your air conditioning unit tuned back up to factory fresh specs. It's still pretty hot for the most part. So they'll get you cooled off and feeling comfortable. Find them online, rsandrews.com. All right, have a great day. Back. We'll see you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.